November 9th was bitterly cold. I cried and pleaded for my father to be left at home. That night, my father and I stayed hidden in a corner of the hall in our apartment, for fear the Nazis would come for us also. We stayed indoors for days, living on preserved food in the pantry. The Nazis closed the Jewish high school. All our books and belongings were confiscated. I was 14 years old. We knew that my father had been taken to the Dachau concentration camp. He returned about 3 weeks later, very depressed and not the same. His health had deteriorated and he had frostbitten feet. We cried a lot during such awful times, but although the future looked very grim, we still had the hope to live through it and that our U.S. quota number would still come through. By then, I only had one school friend, as all the others had left Germany. I still did not know where they went. Our main source of news was the newspaper, because there was always the chance that the radio was tapped. Sometimes, we risked listening to the foreign radio Liechtenstein, though we were always afraid in case we would be caught. It was such a sad and desperate time. We lived in constant fear. My one Jewish friend, Inga, and I began private English lessons. Jewish teachers taught us in their homes. Those teachers were found by our parents who worried about us not going to school. Inga and her parents emigrated to London, England at the beginning of spring. Soon after, my parents learned of the Kindertransport and registered my name on the list. After filling out forms and sending my photo with it, the Quaker Society of Northampton, England, sponsored me and put up the £50 sterling required. That would be $3,500 in today's currency. I left my parents on the 7th of July, 1939. We parted at the gate to the platform of the Frankfurt railway station. My parents were not allowed on the platform. Our parting went very quickly. We were barely allowed time to say goodbye. I do not remember who took me to the train. My parents and I exchanged letters for a while through the Red Cross. The Nazi-censored messages were simple, but at least I knew they were alive. After war was declared on September 1st, 1939, all communication stopped. At the end of the war, I learned from the Red Cross that my parents had been sent to the Lodz ghetto and died in the spring of 1942. The last time I saw my parents was when I was 15 years old. The Kindertransport was the British rescue movement that saved my life. It was an organization of Jews, Quakers, and Christians who worked together between 1938 and 1939 prior to the beginning of the Second World War and rescued 10,000 Jewish children from the hands of the Nazis. On July 7th, 1939, only 7 weeks before war started, very early in the morning, I boarded a sealed train full of children, all under the age of 17. I had said goodbye to my parents at the gate in Frankfurt. The Nazis did not allow parents on the platform to avoid them making a scene. We were all very sad, but hoped that we would meet again in the US when the war was over. I was so scared that I don't remember any details about the train ride, though I now know that there were children much younger than myself on the train, including babies, who were just handed over by their mothers. There were also a few adult chaperones from the rescue movement on board. We sat in compartments. There were 2 long bench seats facing each other, with 8 children per compartment. We all sat quietly, waiting for the train to leave. Men dressed in Nazi uniforms opened the sliding door of our compartment. All the children looked terrified. Since Jews were not counted as German citizens anymore, we had no passports. Instead, they checked our travel document that confirmed that we children didn't owe any money to Germany. I was very worried until we got to the Dutch border. I had visited Holland before, and I knew that it was about 8 hours from Frankfurt. Once we crossed into Holland, we stopped at a station, and women waiting on the platform gave us hot chocolate, sandwiches with chocolate sprinkles, and oranges. At that point, many of us relaxed a little, and it became a kind of adventure. The sandwiches and oranges were delicious, and the children on the train were very much happier. It was another 5 hours on the train before we reached the Hook of Holland and transferred to the ship, which took us across the English Channel. You see, the English Channel is the water between Holland and England, for those of you who didn't know. We sailed overnight, and the next morning took another train to Liverpool Street Station in London. There we were herded into a waiting room with lots of chairs. Each child wore an identification number around their neck. As I watched other children being selected and taken away, I became a little nervous and wondered if the person who was supposed to get me had forgotten to come. Many of the children ended up going to hostels as a group, and some even got to live in an old castle, but I was supposed to live with a foster family. Finally, a white-haired gentleman named Mr. Harris picked me out of the crowd and took me to meet my foster parents, Mr. and Mrs. Barnes of Northampton. Our meeting was just a handshake. They took me by car to their home outside Northampton, a beautiful house in the country. Life in wartime England as a parentless teenager was very difficult for me. I worried constantly about my parents still in Germany. The Barnes family took me into their home out of kindness and also religious conviction. They had known very little about me, and my stay in England was supposed to be temporary. At 15, I was too old to fit into the regular academic school system, and I was a shy and slightly awkward teenager. An apprenticeship was arranged for me at a Northampton ladies' fine clothing store named Claridge's, where I was in training to be a seamstress. At first, I tried to make conversation with the other women working there. They laughed when I spoke because I made so many mistakes. I felt very lucky that my life had been saved by the Kindertransport, but how I wished I could go back to school again. The Barnes family had their own daughter who was about my age and had her own bedroom. We ate meals together, but really didn't have much in common. Mr. Barnes worked as an engineer and enjoyed puttering around the garden, growing corn and other vegetables. The family owned a Cocker Spaniel dog that I played with a bit. I could barely speak English. They spoke no German, and I felt very lonely. After I had been there about 6 months, in the middle of 1940, the area around Northampton was militarized. If I wanted to take the train to London, I would have to get my fingerprints taken at the local police station each time. Finally, the British prohibited German-speaking people from living in the area. England was at war with Germany, and even though I had no German passport, I was still legally an enemy alien. So I left the Barnes family and my apprenticeship in Northampton and was sent to live with Mr. and Mrs. Scott in the tiny village of Alderton. Alderton was a farming village and not close to any city, with lots of sheep, houses with thatched roofs, and no running water. People were very kind, but I had nothing to do. There were no teenagers in my own age. I went for long walks across the fields, picking blackberries along the hedges separating the fields. 2 kindly women neighbors invited me into their cottage and taught me how to knit. This lasted until my 16th birthday the following spring. Once I was 16, I moved yet again. I was now old enough to work in a factory. It was a clothing factory in Northampton. My life living in a normal family was over. I was very poor, and I lived in a house with one other girl and a landlady who made meals. I grew up very quickly. In the factory, most of the workers were women. Each woman would sew the same seam over and over again on hundreds of items of clothing all day long. The wages were very low, and it was dreadfully boring.